I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner in the mountain village of Aula in Tuscany, Italy. Today we have a special guest, Charles Häberl. He's the professor of African and Middle Eastern and South Asian languages and literatures at Rutgers University. And I hear now he's hanging out at Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. One of your main fields of research, right, are the Mandaeans. So let's jump right into it. Can you tell us who are the Mandaeans?
The Mandaeans are a ethno-religious community from the Middle East, specifically formerly from the region, the marshy regions around the head of the Persian Gulf, in Iraq and in Iran today. I say that although since the beginning of the 21st century, since the Allied invasion in 2003, few of them have actually lived in this region. They've been migrating out of it for generations now, and it came to a head after the Iraq War, with the result that you're more likely to find them in places like Sweden and Australia and the United States and Canada, and Germany, of course, than you are in their actual homeland. And that's a relatively recent development within their history as a community. And they're unique for several reasons. Number one is that they practice a faith which is neither Christian nor Muslim nor Jewish, nor Zoroastrian nor any of the other religions with which we're familiar from that region, but is actually the perhaps last surviving Gnostic faith from the region of the Middle East, at least since late antiquity and perhaps longer. Another interesting fact about them is that their traditional liturgy is in Aramaic, and in fact a form of Aramaic, which is quite similar to that of the Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, albeit one in its own unique script, which is, again, unique to this community. No one else uses it. So they kind of break our preconceptions about the Middle East, particularly in its religious and ethnic diversity, its linguistic diversity as well. And that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about this community. And I should also say that in this language and recorded in this script, there's a massive literature.
Yes. Well, it's typical, right, to refer to this group as Mandaeans, but is that more of an outsider label, or do they have other terms that they call themselves by? Because this is often the case with groups.
In the literature, these terms sort of break down into different levels of meaning. So Mandaean is definitely a term that is used within their community, and most often in a bipartite or even tripartite formula. So you'll read in some of the Mandaean texts, Mandaeans and priests, or Tarmidi, Mandoyu Tarmidi, right? So these are presumably lay people and priestly people, perhaps. It's not always entirely clear. The thing about ancient texts, as you well know, is that they don't necessarily lend themselves to easy interpretation in the 21st century. I can't read them as well as I would read an article from the New York Times or what have you. So the context is sometimes lost to us, hopefully not irretrievably, but evidently lost to us. And sometimes this is expanded with a third member to this bipartite scheme, which is Mandoyu Tarmidi Unasurai, right? Nasurai is a term that they use in different ways. At some points, it seems to refer to them ethnically. So, for example, some of the texts refer to the Amot Nasurai, the people, the Nazarene people. And sometimes it seems to refer to a special class of folks, perhaps the most elite priests, the ones who have access to a certain secret esoteric knowledge. This is how Lady Ethel Stefana Drower, who was one of the 20th century's leading researchers into the study of this community. This is how she interpreted this term Nazarene or Nazarene. And of course, it's evocative and interesting to scholars of Christianity and other cognate traditions because it seems so similar to one of the titles of Jesus, and also to the sect to which John the Baptist and so many other Nazarenes belonged, right? Seem to have Nazarites rather, not Nazarenes in this case. So the question is how does this term relate, being used by this Aramaic-speaking Gnostic community on the other fringes of the Fertile Crescent, on the opposite side of the Fertile Crescent from Jerusalem, from all these other places in which the Bible is set, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. How does their use of this term correspond to, or how is it in dialogue with the term as it appears in the New Testament and in other sources? And that's a question that has not satisfactorily been answered.
Right. Well, what do you think of the Palestinian origins thesis? This is proposed, I know, by Joran J. Buckley and others. But what's your take on that?
It's complicated because, let's put it this way. I'm not a huge fan of single origin things. I like to drink my scotch blended. So
Sure.
I'm not necessarily looking for I don't believe, now the faith-based answer to this is that if you spoke to a devout member of this community, they're all descended from Adam, right? So that's your single origin right there. I know who and where Adam was is a separate question. Certainly, I would say that there's a lot to commend this perspective on their history, right? Within their own community, some of the most well-known episodes from their sacred literature, and I'll speak primarily about the Genzarabo, or Great Treasury, Great Library, which is their largest and most sacred text, and also about the Book of John, all of these books have vast portions that are set in and around Jerusalem. And the question is, how do figures like John the Baptist, but also Jesus and Abraham and Moses and all these other figures, how do they end up in the sacred literature of this community from the other side of the ancient world, at least from the other side of the Fertile Crescent? So some scholars, starting with primarily Mark Lidzbarski, but also other people follow him in this, like Rudolf Mutzel and Stefana Drower and Joran Buckley. All of these scholars believe that there's something to it, right? When they talk about their origins, or shall we say their claims upon the figure of John the Baptist in the city of Jerusalem, that there's a historical kernel of truth to this. In my own research, I found that not only do and you've seen this as well, of course, in your own research, that not only do aspects of their text certainly appear to be in dialogue with those of Jews and Christians in a way that you would not expect if they just were simply kind of a product of, the Sasanian Empire in the East and exclusively a Sasanian phenomenon. But also, even their language has aspects which are clearly indebted to Hebrew, loan words and calques and other sort of semantic things that suggest certainly a more profound connection with Jews and with Judaism than a lot of other scholars would grant them. So on the other side, you refer to the Palestinian origins theory. On the other side of this is sort of the Mesopotamian origins theory, the idea that this community is indigenous to Mesopotamia, and that the religion somehow evolved out of traditional Mesopotamian religions, right? The astral cults of Babylon and Nippur and all of these other places. And while I think traditional Mandaeans, like Sheikh Salah was one of their chief priests, right? He's Rishemen now. He's one of the heads of the community. Are horrified by even the suggestion that they would have anything to do with those people. Even Mandaean texts, which appear to have some quantum of Mesopotamian influence upon them, right? Like the Diwan Malkutha Aletha, the Book of Higher Kingship, or the Asfar Malwashi, the Book of the Zodiac, all seem to have, they seem to owe a debt to Mesopotamian culture, to Mesopotamian literature, to Mesopotamian means of knowing, of divination, of the reading of omens. Books seem to it. He says these are jinni books, right? Ignore them. They're not really Mandaean. They belong to our religion. So, for Mandaeans of a certain generation, the ones who belong to a kind of more traditionalist aspect of the religion, this is horrifying and heretical. But also, I mean, as you well know, in the Middle East, right, people who are not part of the dominant Arab and Muslim community tend to like to appeal back or hearken back to earlier civilizations, chief among which were the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So obviously quite a lot of Christians trace their own lineage to the Assyrians and the Babylonians in that region. And I think that sort of ideology has also become very popular among Mandaeans of a secular background as well. They like to see their own origins in these ancient civilizations, and understandably so. So,
sure.
That being said, most of the people pushing in the first part of the 20th century, most of the people pushing this Babylonian or Mesopotamian origins of the Mandaeans were actually sectarian Christians who wanted to kind of push Mandaeans as far away from having anything to say about John the Baptist and delegitimize their claims upon their shared history, the shared history between Jews, Christians, and Mandaeans, and Muslims as well. They're trying to delegitimize that and try and alienate them by making them to be Mesopotamian pagans. So, there's, as with so many things, there's kind of a political impetus there. There's a reason for which people talk about Mesopotamian origins versus Palestinian origins. And so, to make a long story short, to answer your question, clearly the language is the language of the region, right? It's shared also with the Jews and the Christians and the members of other faiths who live in that region. They spoke something very similar, even if it does have some very transparent debts to Hebrew and other Western languages. I mean, there's some Greek in it. There's some Latin as well.
Sure.
So the language is certainly something that's Eastern or Mesopotamian, without a doubt. And their books, like the ones that I mentioned, particularly the Asfar Malwashi, preserve quite a lot of ancient Mesopotamian learning in them, things about the stars and the planets and math, which is fascinating in and of itself. So at least culturally, they have their own debts to these ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. In some respects, they're the people who have preserved these aspects of their learning and their belief. At the same time, I do honestly like Matsuk and Lidzbarski and Buckley and Drower and all the people who studied the Mandaeans and knew them best. I do honestly believe there's something to these stories that they have about John the Baptist and about their shared history with Jews and Christians, and wherever this may have unfolded, right? Whether it involved a physical migration of people or whether it was more of a migration of ideas and beliefs, I still think there's a historical core to it, and there's something that remains there to be discovered and elaborated through careful and rigorous scholarship.
Yes, if I recall correctly, Buckley is cautious, but she basically leaves open the possibility that there may have been some actual historical connection at some point between this group and the historical John the Baptizer. Right, so the jury's still out, but it's certainly intriguing. The denigration, what a group's denigration of their own, especially esoteric literature, of course, is not unique. I've heard that from some Jews in Morocco, for instance, who warn you against the Holy Zohar. This is demonic, right? It should be burned, right? Despite the fact that public processions with the Zohar as a part of Moroccan Judaism. But in any case, in the Qur'an, this group is mentioned called Sabaeans. All right. So what is your understanding of the etymology of that word? And the traditional Islamic, it's not universal, but there are quite a few Islamic authorities who have identified the Sabaeans
Mhm.
with the Mandaeans.
Well, I think if we were having this conversation 100 years ago or more, I think for the most part, Muslim authorities, both Shia and Sunni, were unified in their identification of this group with the Sabi'a of the Quran. And for good reason. They certainly they do fit the traditional Islamic requirements for one of the Ahl al-Kitab, right? They have a prophet, they
Right.
have a bunch of religious books, they have a revealed religion, so everything should be copacetic. Um, the word itself has occasioned quite a lot of spilling of ink, right?
Yes.
There are a number of potential etymologies that a number of scholars give for them. One of them is that it has to do with changing one's religion. So the people of the book would be the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, all of whom we know, right? And then there's this fourth group who are those who change their religion. And if you think about this categorically, it doesn't really fit, right? Right? Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all religious communities, well-defined ones. And then there's sort of a grab bag number four. But I have to admit that throughout time, historically, this fourth community has been accepted as such, and it's been used in this way to encompass quite a lot of other religious communities as well. So there is that. I know that a number of my colleagues espouse this idea that they believe that the fourth community of the people of the book is one that has changed their religion. I'm much more fond of the idea that it comes from the same root as Arabic sabagha, right?
Right.
Meaning to immerse oneself, also to dye clothing, for example.
Yes.
Because in this same root is known from other Semitic languages, chief among them Aramaic, and in which case, due to the standard correspondence between consonants in these languages, the ghain of Arabic becomes an ain in Syriac and other Aramaic languages, and so in Syriac, the same root swa means to dunk or immerse, right? With an ayn, and then in Mandaic, and indeed, to the extent that we can tell throughout Babylonian Aramaic, this final ayn was weakened, right? Possibly through contact with other languages, such as, for example, Akkadian, in which the same shift had occurred, right? Perhaps through contact with Persian, which has no sound like ayn. So it became Saba, and this is indeed one of the terms that Mandaeans use for themselves, right?
Yes.
Even in modern Mendic, you say, Soeno, right? I am baptizing. You could say Nestebion, right? They are baptized, right? So this root is not only it's productive, it's fairly common in their language. So, if we were looking for a community that uses this and with a characteristically local shape of the word, we need look no further than the Mandaeans, right? They use this term.
Right.
It's for one of the fundamental aspects of their faith, which is immersion in flowing water. They don't like to immerse in cut off or dead water. And their language preserves the form that you also find in the Qur'an, if indeed this is cognate with this Arabic term.
Right.
But, it appears to my eyes, basically, and as a full disclaimer, I'm no Quranic scholar here. It appears to my eyes that the term in Arabic, which is somewhat enigmatic, is a borrowing from Aramaic and a specific type of Aramaic, which is the Babylonian Aramaic, spoken in the same region that Mandaeans have lived since time immemorial. So I would say there's actually fairly good chance that this term refers to them. But even if there wasn't, even if we decided, okay, that's total bunk. Arabs don't borrow Aramaic terms into their language, at least not all the Holy Quran, which has no foreign vocabulary in it whatsoever, right? Even if we decided that was the case, it must mean, according to some Arabic lexicographers, it must mean they changed their religion, even if categorically it doesn't fit with these other three categories. Even if we accept all of that, right? Historically, this is how they've been understood, right? They are, in fact, the only community so designated by this term in the region to this very day. So we don't need to do the sort of philological and etymological, specifically etymological work that I just described to adopt this. We actually have a history of usage, which endorses the idea that these people are the fourth people of the book. But
Right.
Scholarship, particularly Orientalist scholarship of the last 100 years or so, has certainly complicated their identification as such, even in the Muslim world.
Right. What do you think? What are the merits of the idea that this term Sabaean in the Quran may designate just a number of groups of some type of, let's say, Gnostic or esoteric complexion, rather than just a single group?
Well, the ethnogenesis, and of course the origins of communities as well, is always a thorny question, whether you're talking about the period of antiquity, for which we have less information, or you're talking about the present day. Do I think that when the Quran was written or revealed, depending on how you believe,
Sure.
that these categories all entailed a specific group, right? Like, for example, when the Quran speaks of Christians, one Nasara, right? Do they, for example, imagine Catholics? Do they think of Jehovah's Witnesses? Or do they intend members of the Church of Latter-day Saints? I have no idea. Right? There's really no way of saying whether or not these terms encompassed all of those groups or not. And similarly with Jews as well, right? I mean, when it speaks of al-Yahud, are they using this term as a narrowly ethnic designation? Does the Quran use this to refer to all of the various denominations of Judaism, united as they are by blood? Or does it only intend a specific one, like sort of like the chief rabbinate in Israel? Is there only one legitimate Judaism and the rest are just sort of schismatics or heretics? So these are questions that people don't ask of the text. I mean, of course, a lot of fine scholars do exactly that, but generally, it behooves us not to scratch too deeply when we're talking about these things. And when it comes to a Sabia, right, in the Quran, not only am I kind of conditioned to believe that it could have encompassed quite a lot of baptizing sects from southern Iraq who incorporated this practice into their faith, of which one survives to this present day and happens to maintain a claim upon this term. I don't find that I don't have any objections to that interpretation of it. And in fact, if you do a deep dive on how Muslims use this term in the early years of the Muslim era, that seems to be how they're using it as well. There seemed to be an array of baptizing groups running around Mesopotamia at that time, including some which they later determined were not legitimate, like the Sabaeans of Haran, for example. They said these people aren't actually monotheists or people of the book at all. They're pagans, but they fooled us by jumping on the bandwagon and saying we are this fourth people of the book. Please don't kill us or force us.
Right.
So yeah, I do think that this term initially probably covered a lot of different groups who answered to this description, as brief and enigmatic as it is. Unfortunately, it should be said, the Quran doesn't really help us in untangling all of the various nuances and meaning of this term. We have to go outside the Quran to the exegetical tradition to figure out what people were thinking, because the Quran is not transparent in this regard.
Right. Yeah, and there is also a tendency to read certain passages about various groups in a historical sense when there may be sometimes a different valence, right, at work there. There may be ideas, right, about various groups, right, rather than historical information, right, that gives us like a 6 o'clock news report version of the group, right? And so it would therefore be historically unwise, right, to take everything a little too literally in a historical sense. So
Yeah.
the difference between people who comprise society and then the sociological concept of a society, right? So the two don't, they overlap, but they don't translate into each other. So
Yeah,
that's what I'm.
absolutely. We're also talking about a text here, right? I mean, the Quran is a
Right.
text. All of these are texts, and it's a difference between a sort of a narrowly positivist and literalist reading of this, and one that kind of takes into consideration the context of it. Like, what are Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Sabaeans doing in this text? Right?
Yes.
What does the text have them do? And does this necessarily refer to people in the real world? Or are they being used here to do something else? What work are they performing within the context of the text?
Right, some idealized sense, or even one way of looking at Talmudic stories, right, is not necessarily to take them as history, but they serve the purpose of proposing and advancing various ethical, moral ideas, or even some theological tropes. But be that as it may, and I know some have wondered if the Sabaeans are Manichaeans, but I don't want to go there. But I did want to ask you, what do you think about Kurt Rudolph, right? His various lists, right, of parallels between start at Qumran, right, which is, of course, a baptizing group, right? They immerse, right, the Jewish. So, but it's they have a particular emphasis on it, at least in their foundation documents. But Rudolph, right, he has these lists. There's a famous essay, at least famous for those in the field, and then it's perpetuated in some of his monograph-length studies. Right, these parallels between Qumran, like the Odes of Solomon, and Mandaeism, and then linked up with the Manichaean Psalms of Thomas. But anyway, so he shows all these parallels, and they seem all to be sharing, right, the water imagery, light imagery, emphasis on knowledge. What do you think about the historical probability there? That he's suggesting that there's some kind of historical continuity between these various groups, albeit, of course, with discontinuities as well. But there's these threads, right? These tropes and these images that link these groups in a very distinctive way.
Yeah.
So
there's a question of whether or not we can produce a genealogy of these groups,
right.
or whether this is some sort of convergent evolution. I think, obviously the period of ultimately all of these groups seem to appeal to a shared imaginary, right? I mean, the stories that they have about shared figures, who may or may not have been historical. I mean, I'm agnostic as to whether they were. But they exist in the literature of these people, and they imply some degree of dependence or evolution. And one way of looking at this is to look at the religious geography of antiquity, to look at all of these communities that we know about. We happen to know quite a lot about the Qumran community because obviously we found manuscripts and they tell us quite a lot about their practices. We know a little bit more about some of the other communities that were characteristic of, say, writ large Second Temple Judaism and what followed it, the movements that emerged from it, including, of course, Judaism as it is conceived today, and Christianity, which emerged out of that same cultural and religious context. And I think I would make the case that things like Mandaeism did as well. But so when you read mostly the work of the early Christian heresiographers, and to the same extent that Jews were also writing about heresies as well, you find kind of shadows of a kind of religious diversity, right? It's also the same diversity you find when you look at all of these apocryphal gospels and all of this information that never quite made it into any of the canons of these religions, it suggests to me that what we have today are just sort of vestiges of a much richer religious tapestry, into which, right, whatever they were practicing at Qumran, the Second Temple Judaism of Qumran, Christianity, Judaism, as it's understood today, Mandaeans, eventually even Islam, they all derive from this moment in time. And, you know, the receipts that they carry of this are their literature, right?
Right.
Now, people, for various reasons, philological, sectarian, literary, what have you, then would try and say some of these communities are more legitimate offsprings of this moment than others, right? Someone might legitimately say, you know, I don't think Mandaeans are really a product of this period and this environment. And, you know, what does it even mean to be a product? Does it mean that every single Mandaean has to have been descended from someone who lived at, say, Qumran? And I think that's the wrong question, right? It's totally the wrong question, because if you look at people of all of these communities, right, they're not like, not every Muslim is descended from Muhammad and his companions, right? Not every Jew is descended from the community of Israelites who were with Moses at Mount Sinai. Not every Christian certainly is descended from Jesus and his original followers. So you have you know, the genealogical argument, I think, falls flat with all of these communities, but which is why I wouldn't necessarily hold the Mandaeans to that same standard. But the bigger question is, to what extent do all of these diverse perspectives upon the religion of that era, of that place in time, to what extent do these diverse perspectives have information to contribute to our understanding of that, of our own origins? And in that, I think Mandaeans do play a very important, a critical role. So if we want to understand what was happening at Qumran, regardless of whether or not Mandaeans, like, you know, if I found a manuscript tomorrow that said, oh, and by the way, those guys at Qumran, they were us, and here are the names of the people who came, and they traveled through the desert, and so on and so forth, it wouldn't change anything, because if we really want to understand what's going on in those texts, we need to understand Mandaeism, just as we need to understand Judaism, Christianity, and all these other traditions.
Right. Well, a personal question, if I may. What got you interested in this group?
It's a long story.
Well, give us the short version if you want to.
The short version is that as a child growing up in Asbury Park, New Jersey, like a lot of children in the 80s and early 90s, is popularized for us like television shows like Stranger Things. I mean, there was I was interested in the occult. I was interested in things like Dungeons and Dragons and all of this stuff. And, you know, there was a satanic panic. And my mother, who was a school teacher and knew how to deal with these things in an intelligent way, decided to get me a copy of the British Museum catalog of amulets and incantations, and see how you know, historical, basically to spark in me a love of antiquity by following my contemporary interests, right? Rather than trying to say, no, that stuff is demonic, you know, you can't look at it, you can't read about it. That would just make me more interested, like a lot of other teenagers. It was a period of rebellion for most people. So, you know, and in the catalog, there were, of course, Mendic incantation bowls, and I was fascinated by that. You know, it was around the time that Ghostbusters came out, if I'm dating myself. So the first Ghostbusters, in which they had these kind of demon traps that would open up, and then the demons, the ghosts would be sucked into them. And that was exactly how I imagined these terracotta demon traps in the British Museum to be. You know, a little more low tech, but they were basically performing the same role. Flash forward to my graduate school years. I was at Harvard, and I had always wanted to pursue my early interests in Aramaic, and particularly its community. I had no idea they were in the US. I was tasked as a grad student, and as grad students very often were, with kind of like the random hewing of wood and carrying of water in organizing a conference This was the Aram Society for Syro-Mesopotamian Studies conference on Mandaeans. It was their first. It was, in fact, as far as I know, the first international conference on the topic. This is already in 1999. And since we were bringing in 3 priests from Iran, and you could still do that in those days, we wanted to have a baptism, and that entailed all kinds of complicated things. So, for example, Mandaean priests must consume, particularly ones from Iran who are very strict in their religion, must consume only water from a flowing source, in this case, the Charles River. So I had to find for them accommodations that were close enough to the Charles River so that they could do their morning ablutions, and they could wash their pots and pans, and they could also have water for cooking and drinking, because they wouldn't take it from a tap. And I needed to find the right permits from the city of Boston for conducting the ceremony on the shores of the Charles River, which we had for the day renamed the Jordan. We got a proclamation from Mayor Thomas Menino. This shows you how great my love for the Mandaean community is that I had the name of the river changed from Charles, which is my own name, to the Jordan, right. Even if just for a day. I needed to get permits for all the various implements and things we would hold there, lifeguards, police officers, all this. So it was a lot of bureaucratic work, as anyone who's organized a conference well knows. And now the Mandaeans took a deep and abiding interest in this because it was the first such international conference, and many of them came from around the world to attend this thing. And they sent someone from New York City, from the borough of Queens, to take a look at the preparations, and chief and foremost the things that I've been doing, to make sure I didn't mess it up.
Sure.
And he was so impressed by the attention to detail and all the work that I had done that he invited me to his home, to his family's home, for meals and just to learn more about his culture and his religion and his language. And he became my first cultural expert or informant, Abu Isa Naso Sobbi, who's unfortunately passed away some years now. But that was how I got into the study of Mandaeans. The sort of ethnographic fieldwork that I did for my doctoral research was mainly almost because this conference was thrown at me, and they said, okay, do all of this work, make sure this happens. I don't care how, just get the papers filled out. And the Mandaeans recognized that this is a service of sort to their community. And so they were very generous to me in response, by being very open with me about their religion and their language.
If in just a few minutes, right, could you just give us an outline, right, of the basic Mandaean beliefs and practices?
All right, so
the afterlife and the rituals.
So effectively, like many other, but not all, faiths that have been deemed Gnostic, they believe that this world is a kind of world of mixture, right? And that pre-existing before it were 2 worlds, the light and the darkness, the worlds of light and the worlds of darkness. And some would say the worlds of light came first, and others would say that the worlds of darkness emerged at the same time, like a shadow from a flame. Even the texts themselves are sometimes ambiguous about this. So within this world, which arose from the admixture of the 2, it was created by one of the emanations of God, shall we say. So like many Gnostic systems, in addition to the worlds of light, there was a God of light, the Godhead, the very highest of the high, from whom a progressive series of emanations emerged, almost like, to use a natural metaphor, like fruit from a plant which emerges from a seed, and so on and so forth. And this is very much how they describe it in their own text. So the seed, the origins of everything, is so far above us that we can't even imagine what this being is like, the Lord of Greatness. But there are a series of things that emerge from the Lord of Greatness that are closer and closer to us until we get to the 4th generation. So they start off with the second life after the great life, and then from them the third. The second life is Yoshamin. The third is Awathur, right? He's often conceived of as being the judge of the living and the dead. And then finally, the son of Awathur, with a Lilith, a child of darkness, is Iftahil, right? Whose name seems similar to that of the Egyptian, demiurge of Ptah. So strangely enough, and he is in many ways the king or the ruler of this world, because he, like us, is a child of the light and the darkness. So he went and in violation of the orders they'd been given, decided to create a world of his own. And that was the origin of our world. So the world became a kind of a proving ground or a battleground between light and darkness. And our roles in this world, or I should say those of us who are faithful Mandaeans, is to find our way back to our homes in the light world, out of this world of mixture. So, and one way of doing that is by making a connection or lofa with the light world. So Mandaeans believe that the flowing waters that emerge from springs and rivers and from the sky and all these places descend from the worlds of light. And with it, they form a connection, almost like an electric current. So when you touch running water, you are touching something that goes all the way back to this world of light, which is our ultimate home. And that is one reason why Mandaeans perform frequent baptisms in running water, in order to maintain this connection and thereby eliminate the impurities that arise from our connection with this contaminating world. So there are numerous forms of ablutions, some more major than others, and some more effective for getting major contamination as opposed to the minor things that happen from day to day. But these are commemorated in ritual baptisms, right, which are done usually on Sundays and at certain times of years. After you die, now, regardless of how good a person you've been and what you've done in order to avoid the world's contaminations, after you die, you're still not quite ready for prime time, right? You can't go directly to the world of light. According to one school of belief, there is a world much like ours. Our world is called Tivil. There's a world called Mshunakushta, which is on the opposite side of ours. Some would say it's far to the north beyond a mountain range, and which is just like ours, but it's perfect. There's no flaw within it. So it occupies the same plane as ours. In theory, you or I could travel there to Kushta if we wanted to. But when we die, right, our souls transcend, they occupy there a body which is perfect, right, with no defects, with no scars or blemishes. And at some point, we will then travel, right, through the purgatories, right, these matorothe, these watch houses in the heavens, of which there are a number of at least 7, right, associated with the 7 visible planets, right? So in order for us to become fully pure, for our souls as well as our bodies to become completely pure for return to the worlds of light, we have to pass through a cleansing ritual in the sky, which entails staying in a kind of prison, depending on what we did that was so wrong during our time here on Earth. And it just so happens that these prisons are run by the planets, right? They're somewhere above here, they're somewhere up in the sky. And so as our soul ascends to the worlds of light, we pass through these purgatories. So that, in a nutshell, is their belief about the origins of the world and the fate of the soul after death. They also believe in end times, right? They have a developed eschatology, and much of that involves evil. So at one point, the Savior's spirit, Hebel Ziwa, who brought all of us these wonderful books of literature in the Mandaic language, descended into hell as if to harrow it. There he brought up among other things, he became involved with a woman, although they would say that actually it was a double of him that became involved. It was not him. But basically, there is a woman there named Ruha, who is the evil spirit, and she's the source of everything that's bad in this world, particularly other religions, right? And she had relations with, in quick succession, her father, her brother, and her son. The result of which were all kinds of monsters, and also the aforementioned visible planets, which govern our fates after we die. They were the product of these incestuous liaisons. So one of the things that the evil spirit does is that she produces this sort of giant serpent called Ur, who's kind of like an immense snake, and his mouth is so wide he could swallow the earth and the moon together, right? All in one gulp. And what happens at the end of time is that he will emerge from his own slumber and he will come and eat all of the planets up, getting rid of the traces of this material world in which we live. At which point, the only thing that will exist is going to be the worlds of light.
Right. Well, that brings me to another question that may be relating to your personal history, I imagine, but I'll introduce it this way, right? When we pick up a typical peer-reviewed academic journal, right, we'll read through the various essays, and most of them are matter of fact. They address the subject at hand, right, and assess probabilities for historical reconstructions or whatever, right? But they may be interesting. But there are some scholars, and you're one of them, right? When we come across your work, right, we find all of that, but then interspersed with it is like P.K. Dick or Lovecraft. So what's that about? What's that about?
Yeah, no, I try and, I mean, look, Walter Benjamin said that one of the tasks of the historian, much like the task of the translator, which is to find within the text, it's sort of to reproduce within the reader the same experience the reader would have reading the text in its original, right? Not to translate things word for word, but basically to kind of get it a higher significance or relevance of the text for the reader. And he felt the same way about historians, right? The goal, the task of the historian is to make manifest the relevance of history, not to create a list of dates and things that happened on days, right? That's a chronicle. That's not history in the way that it isn't. It's understood today in the 21st century. Right. And the chronicles are, having published on chronicles, I can say they're a little dull as reading goes, right? When you just have a list of dates. Right. So my job is to make things relevant and make the relevance manifest in the Benjaminian sense, both as a translator and a historian. And, sometimes this entails appealing to pop culture, right? And so I can't speak necessarily to the pop culture of everyone. I know what I grew up with. I know what things, like as I mentioned before, talking about Ghostbusters and how the demon traps in Ghostbusters reminded me, the ghost traps in Ghostbusters remind me of the terracotta demon traps from Iraq. Given kind of the nature of Anglophone literature and media in the world today, it's a surefire bet that there are other people who had similar experiences. So it is somewhat, how would you say, umbilico-skeptic? I feel in a sense it's a lot of what I do is almost intellectual masturbation, in the sense that I am making things, I'm teasing out the things that I find interesting about a text or about a community or about a religion, and I'm serving them to other people in the hopes that they might also find them interesting as well. So that is why, in addition to all of these sort of things that are assumed to have universal relevance, right? When you talk about, for example, philological inquiry, right? Philology is famously supposed to be a science without theory. It just is. So it hasn't really withstood the test of time, as well as I think the people who, 100 plus years ago, Max Muller could say that philology was the queen of the sciences, and I doubt anyone would believe that today.
Right.
So, I could adopt that persona of the voice from nowhere, right? The person who is trying to talk about the universal relevance of something. But I find that relevance is incredibly subjective. And, I think Benjamin would agree with me on this. Let's leave my reading of Benjamin. Whether he agrees with me on that is irrelevant at this point. So if I can at least communicate honestly and truthfully to my readers what it is that I find interesting about this text, well, then I've been honest with them, right?
Right.
If I just simply
Right.
say to my readers, this is important, you should think it is important too, otherwise you're a bad person, then I've lost a big chunk of them. And I haven't been honest with myself, right? And as I think I probably told you before, right? Feynman had these great essays about physics, and he said, what makes science science, right? Well, the first rule of science is don't fool anyone, and you are the easiest person to fool.
Right.
So really, it's don't fool yourself. So I'm not fooling myself when I say this is interesting to me, right? This is if I can weave Philip K. Dick into what I'm writing, or Ghostbusters or Fallout or Walter Benjamin or any of these people, if I can do that and I'm honest about why I'm doing it, then at least I've not fooled myself, and hopefully not my readers either.
Right. Right. Well, it's perhaps irrelevant also that I think that Nietzsche would enjoy reading your work. Oh, there's a philosophy of history, right? He had this particular philosophy of history, which is definitely opposed to the regular, right, list of dates and personages.
Right. And we're
But
still looking at his intervention as well. Like, that sort of thing, that reaction he had against this traditional historiography is very much something that is relevant to this day and that we're still living with.
Right, and it injects a little bit of humanity into things. After all, that's what we all are, right? And one cannot help but thinking of course, that old account, the old story of Nietzsche when he breaks down, right, when he sees this horse being beaten.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's really a depth of humanity there. But as I say, irrelevant that I think he would probably enjoy your work. But in any case, where do you see Mandaean studies going in the future, or where would you want it to go? What direction? What really needs to be addressed?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because the sort of people who traditionally do this sort of work are very much in the classical philological vein. So, right, if I were a classicist studying Greek or Latin, or if I were studying classical Arabic, these fields are very much silos, right? Even Syriac, I was having a conversation earlier today at the Institute about Syriac studies, and Syriac scholars don't really look beyond Greek and sometimes Arabic into the literary traditions of other people, right? They barely even engage with other Aramaic traditions. So, and I kind of feel like even now we're waking up to the realization that those people who are classicists, for example, that the world is much larger than the Greco-Roman world. A day doesn't go by when you hear about people talking about global classics or what have you. And in trying to incorporate more cultures, more languages, more traditions, more literatures into their study of the classics, to open up the canon, so to speak. In order to study Mandaic, I can't live in a silo, right? I cannot possibly do the things that I do and pretend there is no other world out there. I can't say, at a very minimum, you need to be involved with Arabic literature. You should know that classical, the literatures of classical antiquity. You should know the Bible. You should know, you should ideally know Persian literature as well. So there's all kinds of things that you need to know. I mean, I would love to know more about, I studied Akkadian, but I'm not an Assyriologist. I would love to know more about this stratum of Mesopotamian culture that you find in literature as well. That's important. So the only way for the field to grow is to grow out, right? I mean, if there were a lot of people studying Mandaic and there were Mandaic departments in every university, then it would become calcified and it would become a silo, just like the classics or the study of classical Arabic, or a lot of other disciplines as well. And you wouldn't need to do any of these things. And then it becomes scholastic at that point, right? It's not really generating any new insights. The only hope I have from the study of Mandaic is that, and of Mandaean literature and the Mandaeans in general, is that they're incorporated more organically into a holistic view of all of these things. So like If you have a department of area studies in which they're studying the Middle East, well, there is this intensely fascinating community with a rich heritage, which is completely off the radar of most people who study the region. If you study the Bible, right, like many people, the Bible scholars live in a silo. Very often they have their own schools, seminaries, right, that are
Right,
kind of
right.
cordoned off from the rest of the world. They are other people who have a completely different engagement with biblical literature that would look completely unfamiliar, strange, and alien to you and to your presumed interlocutors. And I find by broadening our own horizons, we make ourselves better scholars. So there's that reason. I mean, the study of the history of Islam and of the Arabs, right? This is a community that the literature of which stretches back at least 1,400 years, I would say more, which has quite a lot to tell us about the history of Islam, of the Arab conquests, of how the Middle East became what it is today, in many respects. And so, when people talk about academia not going anywhere, when they talk about how everything has sort of become, what is the word? When there's a lack of inspiration, when people just keep going over the old stuff over and over again, a large part of that is because people are just simply neglecting potential sources of inspiration and information, like this entire community with its library of literature and its beliefs that are completely unlike, in the most interesting ways, those of their neighboring communities, and completely like them in other extremely interesting ways. And so while I don't have a lot of hope for Mandaic studies as a silo of its own to kind of continue, and I have almost no students. Mandaic isn't really taught anywhere, not even at Rutgers where I teach. We don't offer courses on Mandaic. I've had some experience and success teaching it in Russia and Ukraine, and I'm obviously not doing that this year for reasons which we need not go into. And so, I don't know what form or shape the academic study of Mandaic and Mandaeism will be in the 20th century. We have, if you know anything about the history of scholarship on this, and I know you do, you can see that there are gaps in its resume, right? There are gaps in the resume of the history of Mandaeism. You go for there's a brief periods of activity like there were during the 10s and the 20s and the 30s, and then nothing for a few decades. And then a lady Drower appears and emerges, and then there's another brief period of scholarly activity, and then that disappears for a few years. And I think we're when I retire, which will probably be sooner rather than later, that may be it for it in North America. I don't have any really one to carry on the torch here, unfortunately. So my hope is that rather than just sort of pinning my hopes on my own individual students to carry it on, or my colleagues at other institutions to keep doing it after I stop, my hope is that those people who are working in parallel areas will be sufficiently intrigued to incorporate Mandaeism into their own practices, right? So that they can't ignore it.
Right. Well, it seems to me that students, studying critically, studying Qur'an, should also have to, and I'm going out on a limb here, right? But they should really have to also study Mandaic and Mandaean literature, just because of the historical relation between nascent Islam, right, and thereafter, and the Mandaeans, right? After all, in the Mandaean literature, there are, right, as you know, these mentions of this new prophet of Islam, right? And of course, they're very critical, very negative, but nonetheless, right, there is a connection there, a historical connection. And as you also know, in my own research, I do have this suspicion that a lot of the similarities, these lexical similarities in certain phrases that we find shared between the Quran, even starting with the Fatiha, right, the opening of the Quran, and the first page of the Ginsa, right? How do we explain these similarities? Well, the standard response is, well, this is an influence, right, from Islam onto this group, or the Mandaeans are absorbing some Islamic language for various reasons, one of which may theoretically have been to placate, right, the majority group, or for whatever reason. But I still suspect that some of this may be that well, let me ask, why do we assume a priori that any of these similarities must be the influence of the Quran or Islam on Mandaeism instead of the other way around? Well,
Right.
Apart from the merits or demerits of my suspicion, there's still undoubtedly some connection, right, between these two bodies of literature. So that's on my wish list, that in the future, if someone is studying Quran, they should be required to have at least a semester, right, of Mandaean history, right. And if one really wants to be a proficient Western critical scholar of the Quran, certainly one should, I think, know Mandaic, be able to read these texts in their original language. Well, be that as it may, this has been fascinating and enlightening, and you're very eloquent, and I appreciate you spending this time
My
with
pleasure.
me here. Yes, and perhaps we'll meet up again sometime, maybe on the same topic, or maybe we'll venture into areas like P.K. Dick or
Yeah.
Lovecraft and pedagogy, right? Because I think that's an important topic that could be expanded. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you the next time around.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.